In the previous lessons, we examined similarities and differences between biblical and extra-biblical creation traditions. The connections between the biblical creation stories and those of the surrounding cultures are mainly indirect in nature. These connections indicate a common ancient Near Eastern background or similar scientific and ideological perceptions, but not direct literary dependence. This is not the case with the flood story. The flood story is considered one of the classic and most famous examples of a direct parallel between the Bible and ancient Near Eastern literature. The connections between the biblical and Mesopotamian flood stories are close and clear. The first evidence of a Mesopotamian flood story was discovered by the British scholar George Smith in 1872. His discovery aroused a great deal of excitement among the public. He proved that the biblical flood story had a very similar cuneiform parallel.
The story became famous thanks to this man, George Smith. And the story goes that he was employed in a printing house, and in his lunch breaks he would come to the museum. He was very interested in these new discoveries that were coming to the museum, and after a while the staff noticed that this young gentleman had taken a great interest and he seemed to know what he was doing, and eventually they took him on the staff and they gave him a job putting together these fragments of tablets and helping the department to publish them, essentially. And this was a great stroke of luck because he seems to be one of the best cuneiform scholars who ever lived. And he did a remarkable job in the 19th century, so for the first time sorting out this enormous scatter of fragments and putting them back into more or less complete tablets. And one of the groups of tablets he was working on, and this is one nice example, was a story of somebody that he knew as Izdubar, but we now know as Gilgamesh. And to his remarkable surprise, he found that one of these stories was about a flood, and it bore incredible similarity to the well-known biblical flood story. And this is a tablet that he pieced together from many, many fragments. You see just how complicated a job this was. And we see also here on the end this bubbling from the destruction of the library where the clay is turned to glass, essentially. So he's pieced this together from fragments. But the story goes that such was his excitement once one of these fragments he was reading had been cleaned and he could read for the first time this story, that to the amazement of everybody present, he undressed and ran around the room. And I think if you look at how things were in Victorian England, this is probably he undid his necktie a bit and got very excited. But still, it created a lot of drama at the time. You can imagine the excitement of being the first person to read this. It's an incredible story. In 1872, he unleashed his discovery to the world, and in December in London at the Society for Biblical Archaeology, he gave a lecture which was attended by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the sitting Prime Minister, the only time a sitting British Prime Minister has ever attended an Assyriological lecture. Hopefully not the last. And he amazed the world, and very soon it was on the front pages of newspapers around the world that here was essentially the biblical flood. George Smith has a very interesting life story, and his very tragic story, because in 1873, the Daily Telegraph, amazed by his discoveries, paid for him to go back to Iraq to find the missing bit, because you see from the tablets there are gaps in the story, and he was adamant that he could find the missing bits. So they send him off. In 1873, he goes off to Iraq, and he digs at Nineveh, and he finds what he thinks is the missing piece of his flood story. And very excitedly, he reports back to the Daily Telegraph, who seem to have decided that now he's found this piece of clay, it's enough. So they cancel his excavations, much to his disappointment, because that wasn't quite the gist of the message that he sent. And on his way back, he contracts an illness and he dies.
Later, Smith's finding proved to be the first of many Mesopotamian and extra-Mesopotamian sources describing the flood. Today, we know of several important sources related to the flood story. The most important are two famous Mesopotamian epics known as Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. The epic known as Atrahasis describes the beginning of history from the creation of humankind by the gods to the story of the flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh could be considered the most important Mesopotamian literary work. This epic tells the story of the hero king Gilgamesh, his close friendship with the wild man Enkidu, and his quest for eternal life. As part of this quest, Gilgamesh meets the only human being who survived the primeval flood, Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood and of his survival. In addition to these two canonical works, the flood is also mentioned in other Mesopotamian sources. Among these are two recently discovered sources, known as the Ark Tablet and the flood fragment from Ugarit. We will discuss them later. In addition, some works mention the flood briefly as a well-known event while discussing other matters. A striking example is the text known as the Sumerian King List. This work lists the royal dynasties that ruled the world at the beginning of history, dividing them to those who ruled before the flood and those who ruled after the flood. The Sumerian king list is reminiscent of the lists of generations in the book of Genesis, which detailed the genealogy of early humanity in two different lists. One of these is dedicated to the 10 generations preceding the flood in Genesis 5. The other enumerates the 10 generations following it in Genesis 11. Because the Sumerian king list mentions the flood but does not refer to it in detail, we will not discuss it further. You may find more information about this text and its possible relation to the Bible in the syllabus.